Hi, this is the lecture for the first Monday in March, which would be the first, March 1st of 2021. This is for European history. Bless you. Tissues up there if you need it. So, if you want to close the window or leave it open, I don't care. Just wanted to let you know you have the option. You will have seen the end of Zulu, and you will have turned in your Zulu movie worksheet. What are some observations that you have? Because in this clash, you see basically a pastoral people, Neolithic. The Zulu have iron-tipped weapons, but they're basically a Neolithic people. They have cattle ranching, some farming, but for the most part, they're people of cattle. Clashing with an industrial age 19th century Britain. So what I'm going to do is ask you, in the time it's going to take me, which will be 40 seconds, I will count, to get my die, to think of one or two observations comparing and contrasting the industrial era Brits and South Africans with the Neolithic Zulu. Have something. Okay, first off, I will let anyone who wishes to volunteer an observation do so. Oh.
Well, when the British soldiers were injured, the medics, I mean, even if they were like really badly injured, they would do everything in their power to try to save them. I mean, because they didn't have that many men with them.
Yeah.
Versus the Zulu, the commander actually like sent warriors out to die to test their power. So it's just kind of like a big contrast of how they treated it.
It's a huge contrast. It's not as big as it might be for this reason. In the words of Robert E. Lee, a good soldier must love the army, but a good general must be willing to destroy that which he loves for victory. A good general is always going to sacrifice troops. A bad general will too, but a bad general will do it to no good end. A good general will do it with actual intent to victory. There are times when you need to order a unit to make a diversionary attack or a sacrifice. You see this in a game like chess, where you'll sacrifice a pawn here to have an option of getting a queen there. The identity of the pawn, it's not great. It's like being Poland if you're playing a European strategy game. It's not really a great place to be. But all generals are willing to do that. However, you're onto something. I really learned this lesson when I had one of my nieces come over from China. Her mother, the sister of the wife of my friend, the wife who came over just before Tiananmen Square, stayed in China. This niece arrived at age 6 or 7 in the United States. And I saw her. She's now a sophomore or junior in college. I've seen her grow up. When she first came here, she was very quiet, obviously because she was still learning English. She was very obedient because she didn't want to make any trouble for herself. There wasn't much of a personality there. I'm going to say that again because it's almost impossible to imagine, for us to imagine, a 7-year-old girl without much of a personality, but she didn't have one. That individuality grew as a result of two things. Number one, the natural development that a person goes through between ages 7 and 22. And two, being here in the United States. There are facets of individuality that our society indulges and encourages. In fact, we insist that each person be an individual. We expect it. Our education system is designed to bring that individualism out. Our society, too. By this point in your lives, you all have things that you like doing and things that give you satisfaction, and hopefully these things are wide-ranging, from physical activities to artistic endeavors to academic discovery and just things that are fun. You are individuals. You have your own beliefs, your own characteristics, your own personality, your own character. An equivalent person in a totalitarian police state does not have all those things. My niece didn't have those things. She developed them here. One of the horror shows of her life is that because of the bizarre system of immigration that we have, she's done everything legally. As a legal alien, she was forced to go to Catholic school because she didn't want anyone claiming that her education was on taxpayers' dime. Meanwhile, how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of illegals who came across the southern border get free services of all kinds in California? The development of what we would call a personality is a byproduct of living in a peaceful, prosperous society. My Irish ancestors didn't have it. This is something that my mother talks about a lot. If you were Irish when the English were ruling Ireland and you stood out as being particularly ebullient, a sparkling personality, you'd get stepped on. You'd get singled out. So, like all subject peoples, the Irish learned to fit in, to hide their individuality, not to indulge it, not to grow it. If you're in a society where being noticed means that you're going to be victimized, you don't get noticed. Some of my earliest schooling were in schools that had gangs, and they were not nice schools, and you did not want to get noticed by the gangs. The Zulu weren't brutal like that. The Zulu were not decadent like a prison where everyone is either a part of a gang or everyone's victim, or a school that has gang activity. The Zulu are a proud people. They're a rising people. They, however, did everything in common. That wedding ceremony, you saw it at the beginning. 1,000 braves marry 1,000 maidens. They're paired up by their chiefs. Maybe they're even paired up randomly by who they happen to dance with. They eat together. They fight together. They get married together. They raise children together. One of the characteristics of Neolithic life is what we would consider a shocking lack of privacy. Each of the Welsh soldiers, and the English, and the Swiss, and the Boer, they all had a personality. Now, this isn't to say that the Zulus didn't have the raw materials for a personality. Of course they did. They're human beings. But Zulu culture was a communitarian culture. You were a brave. You were a maiden. The chiefs were allowed to indulge in certain individual traits, but most people did their part. Now, did the private personality come out at times? Sure, but it never really developed. It was part of something that just was never given scope. If you are a painter with subtlety to do things with a two-dimensional medium that makes it almost three-dimensional, but you're never given an opportunity to paint, that ability is inchoate. It's in you, but it's unexpressed. It's undeveloped. If you're a natural athlete, but you never have a chance to play sports, same thing. If you're a natural writer, but you're illiterate. So the cultures of the two are radically different in terms of the individual. That's a big thing. That's a big deal. It's not simply because the movie was made by white people, about white people, for white people, where the blacks were considered to be just the enemy. It is the nature of the culture. There is a difference between cultures. Some cultures are much more indulgent and insistent that each individual be an individual, distinct, discrete, separate, alone, with a unique contribution. Others insist on conformity. Any thoughts on that? Before I ask for another observation.
Well, kind of going off the different culture, I thought it was interesting how the music kind of went along with that, and how like the Zulus used music and how the British used music, and it almost in a way like described them like the British. It was the choir was very orderly and it had to be like a certain rank and everything, and the Zulu, it was a lot more just like powerful, and they used it when they were fighting and everything, and it was really interesting to see.
The scene of the competing songs is one of my favorite scenes ever in a movie. And if for whatever reason you've cheated yourself by not seeing the whole movie, see it. Because that scene deserves to be shown in context. When the Zulu are singing their song and the Welsh belt out Men of Harlech, which is a classic song of Wales. It's like their unofficial anthem. Yeah. I can't describe it better than the song shows. The Zulu, there are no top tenors, mind. The Zulu are singing in concert, and it's very basic. This isn't to say it's simple. Zulu music is actually quite complex. But it is from the chest. In the case of the choir, you've got all these different voices working together with different levels of bass and tenor and all these things in between. I'm not a singer, I'm not a choir person, I don't understand these things. But if you are, hopefully that scene revealed differences in the culture that I, as a non-music person, can only hint at. Did you have another question, or was that the observation?
No, that was just the observation.
Are there any other big observations that you have, pairing or contrasting these? Miss and then Miss.
Obviously the weapons that they used were very different. So the Brits, who had like a lot less men, their gun was so much more effective than the spear, which contributed to them winning.
The Martinihenry Rifle is a single-shot weapon that fires a big, chunky bullet. Much bigger than the bullets that modern assault weapons and battle rifles use. Basically, it's intended to be a one-shot, knock-down-your-enemy type weapon. And a proficient soldier, you can see how quickly they could load and unload. It's not as quick as a modern semi-automatic or automatic weapon, but it's still fast. And what this allows, and this is one of the classic things about the colonial wars. Again and again, you've got these tiny numbers of Europeans conquering vast areas. How do they do it? Well, you've seen how they do it. Guns are almost always undervalued in movies because movies want to show you the drama. And so if you're a director or a producer and you're designing a movie and you have a chance to either show people fighting at gunfighting ranges of hundreds of yards or fighting up close with swords, the sword fight is going to be much more interesting to watch visually. And so you end up with Star Wars, where you have a single guy with a plasma sword, the lightsaber, defeating ridiculous numbers of stormtroopers who cannot shoot. Now, it helps that the stormtroopers cannot shoot, because if they could shoot, they'd win. If they had armor that actually did something other than make them less easy to shoot, which, what does stormtrooper armor actually do other than look white and creepy?
It's a uniform made of plastic.
Yes, exactly. And they say it's designed to, deflect laser weapons, but no, the Ewoks didn't use laser weapons. A plasma sword isn't a laser weapon. I could wear it's the most useless armor. It only works because they don't shoot well. So in this case, you actually see what firepower can do. Definitely. And the firepower of an industrial society is so superior. I mean, Cortez didn't have that kind of advantage over the Aztecs, but he did. Even though his weapons, his firearms were far more primitive, the fact that the Aztecs had never seen a sword before, had never seen metal armor before, had never seen any kind of firearm before, and Cortez had cannon with him. All of these things made it a psychological shock. And then when Cortez got the Indians on his side that were rebelling against Aztec rule, same sort of thing. You could also see the difference in uniforms. By the way, why do the British, and I will call on you, why do the British wear red? Does anyone know this? I'll give you a hint. It's the same reason why the Romans wore red. There's a reason, a definite reason why the British soldier of the imperial era and the Roman soldier all wore red. Yes?
This is like not a serious answer, but there is the whole marketing thing where the colors of red and yellow are supposed to make you hungry. So maybe it was
Wait, so communism makes you hungry because the communist colors are always red and yellow? Well, communism does, in fact, make you hungry. It restricts food production. That's hilarious. I never heard that. Is that why McDonald's argues that it uses communist colors in its golden arches?
Red and yellow.
They make you hungry. Why, they make you think of campfires or something?
I don't know.
That's weird.
They put like tiles and stuff.
I have never heard that. I have never heard that.
It might be a side effect to make them go through their rations fast.
It could be. It could be. No. What it is what color is blood?
Oh, it is what I think it is. You can't see me.
Yeah, you can't see me bleeding. That's exactly what, right. So the Romans and the British both used red for that purpose so that the enemy wouldn't know when they got a hit. The French, on the other hand, of the Royal era, they wore white uniforms. Think about that. And our Navy still uses white dress uniforms. The other service is called Naval Officers Ice Cream Salesmen because in tropical climates they wear these completely white polyester horrible uniforms. Yes, and then yes.
So I thought it was interesting how the Zulu were very, they had a lot of pride in what they did, but they were still able to, surrender when they knew they needed to. And they, even went as far to salute the Brits. And I thought that was really interesting because the Brits were going to fight until they were all dead. They weren't going to give up, but the Zulu knew when to give up and when to respect the other side.
You're right. And that indicates something about the Zulu. This movie didn't see the Zulu as savages. They saw them as a different culture. To a Zulu, there's nothing more important than physical courage and the warrior spirit. This is true of a lot of societies around the world. If you want to impress the Arabs, be brave and strong in war, because the Arabs see themselves as a warrior people. The Zulu are definitely a warrior people. And what a warrior has to master more than anything else, to the extent I understand it, is their own fear. The first conflict that a warrior has to win is over their own fear. All of us at one time or another have faced physical confrontations, I'm sure of this. And either you fought or you've backed down or you found some other way around it. Some people develop a sharp mouth and a good sense of humor to deal with bullies. There are all sorts of ways. A warrior has to overcome their own fear of the enemy before they can face the enemy bravely. That doesn't mean the fear's gone. It means that it's put in its cage. And the British clearly did that. They fought and fought and fought and fought and fought. And that earned the Zulu respect. And they showed that respect. And that's something else. Tribal people tend to be very straightforward. Not because they're stupid, but because honesty it feels good. So if you encounter somebody in a conflict who's really good and surprising, showing respect for that, I think, is a natural thing. And the Zulu do that. For example, if you respect arguing about politics, if you think that you're good at it, and if you value others who are very good at it, and you encounter somebody on the other side who just takes your arguments and goes, psst, 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 not in a rude way, but just because they're that darn good. On some level, you probably want to say, you're wrong about everything, but darn, you're good at being wrong. You know what I mean? And the Zulu do that. Now, I will say, and this is something I personally don't understand, because Rorke's Drift is near enough to a stream to require a bridge. But what the historians say about why the Zulu left, they didn't only just decide, okay, this is enough. They also ran out of water. And they needed to leave because you can only go so far without water. I don't get it. I've studied the records. They all say the Zulu left because they ran out of water. But there's a stream right there. I don't understand. But that's what happened, and I have to trust the sources.
Look,
So
that's some dirty street water.
that's I don't know. I don't get it. I don't
The
understand.
red uniforms.
Yeah, that's it. They made them thirsty. They
Oh,
just
yeah,
didn't
really
have
did.
enough water.
Had to fill their stomachs with something.
Exactly.
Ran the stream dry.
Yeah, so bring me my red shirt and my brown pants.
Yeah.
But, other than that, really,
That's subtle, by the way, Sam. I'm sure nobody else is going to understand what you mean. Go on.
But I was gonna say the when they're fighting, I don't think the British really had them like outgunned with weaponry. It's just the Zulu don't know how to fire their weapons. It's like they every 10 shots they hit one. They hit someone somewhere.
Okay, here's the thing about training. Unless you have a montage, like in a movie, shooting is actually not easy at range. Shooting something up close is fairly easy. It's point and shoot. If we were shooting laser weapons, it would be fairly easy because it's point and shoot. But a real bullet goes down over time, is subject to wind, is subject to the air pressure. Believe it or not, a bullet travels a little bit faster in the Arctic than it does in the tropical jungle because of the density of the air. If you're fighting in the mountains, it acts differently than you're fighting at sea level. Being a good long-range sniper is actually something that takes years of work, even if you start out like a good shot. And the Zulu had these weapons for a few hours, maybe a couple of days. So yeah, the fact that they hit anything is amazing. It's the Martinihenry for a single-shot weapon is a good weapon. But yeah, the British soldiers had years of training behind them, and they were much better riflemen.
I know the shooting thing at least because I've been shooting. The Boy Scouts always have like
A rifleman,
old 22s. I've been shooting those for years.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still not the greatest shot. I can hit something.
Yeah. I can hit anything I want to almost at close range. But I've never been a good long-range shot. And that's why I'm not a hunter. I have my guns for personal defense. I don't have them for if I ever have to hunt, I hope I'll have dynamite so I can fish. A lot of fish.
Once again, makes me think of the 18.
Yeah. They're not stupid. They make all sorts of vehicles. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about this. We talked a little bit about the use of music and something that you will get from pre-civilized tribes is that music is a big deal because music brings people together. You know how in opera you can have 4 or 5 different conversations happening simultaneously? This can also be done in a musical on Broadway. Try that in reality, and it doesn't work. You try that in a play where people are just talking over one another, it will not work. It's a cacophony. But music makes it possible. Why is music so important to us? Well, there are many reasons, but not the least of which is inside of us is a metronome. And that metronome is pumping blood every moment of our lives, rhythmically. And I think that all music, especially primitive music that's percussive, tends to base itself on the heartbeat at various emotional states. I also know that minor chords tend to be sadder than major chords, but my knowledge of music is, again, limited. Just understand it's very important to organize everything in pre-civilized tribes. If any of you have a chance to learn about the local native tribes, the Coeur d'Alene, the Nez Perce, whatever, try to learn how music plays a role in their traditions. And I'm sure you'll find it's pretty central. Any other thoughts before we move on? Yeah.
It seems like there was definitely like a sense of overconfidence on both sides.
Oh, yeah.
Just in the beginning.
Well, after the British lost their army on Isandlwana, their overconfidence was gone. You saw those cavalry run away. But yeah, no. If you have 4,000 men, you're facing fewer than 200. It's going to take an amazing set of circumstances for those 200 to prevail, or even a remnant of them to even survive. I mean, if nothing else, if the Zulu general had stopped being a general and just become a butcher, conceivably he could have just sent all 4,000 men, Battle of Cannae style, at the British, and the British would have run out of ammo. But a general doesn't do that. He doesn't wait. I mean, the men he spent testing the British firepower were spent for a very particular reason. Had he just sent the men out there to see if they had more chests than the British had bullets, the Zulu probably wouldn't have mutinied, but most soldiers would. Anyway, yeah, there was, and that is typical of cultures, by the way. Cultures tend to either amplify the strengths of the enemy and make them into supermen, like when we fought the Japanese in the early part of World War II. The Japanese seemed like supermen on the ground. They could go through the jungle, they could survive with no supplies, and they'd still come out ready to stick you with a bayonet. And it took time to learn how to fight them. And once we learned how to fight them, we actually had a real advantage, because the Japanese tendency to do a banzai charge was easy to trip off at first. And if you can get the Japanese to banzai charge you when you have machine gun emplacements, you win. And that's what happened on Guadalcanal. In any event, we'll talk more about that. Thank you for your attention. I hope you like the movie. It is one of my favorites. Okay. So the British win the Anglo-Zulu War. Cetewayo, the Zulu king, ends up going to London to meet with Queen Victoria. And he dresses up in a tuxedo, a proper Victorian-era tuxedo. And they act like, fellow kings. The British are very good at bringing royalty into their commonwealth. And the Zulu maintained a semi-independent state within the British Empire for quite a long time. It wasn't until the modern black-majority South African regime took over in the mid-1990s that the distinct rights that Zulus had within Zululand were taken away and replaced with just generic South African rights. Cecil Rhodes. In your book, you're going to see a drawing of, not your handout, but you'll see a drawing of an Englishman with a mustache and spectacles standing bestriding Africa. And one of his legs will be in Cairo, and the other of his legs will be in Cape Town, and he's sort of in this pose. That's Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes is governor of South Africa for a brief period of time in the 1880s. And he is governor at a time when diamond strikes are being made. Most of the world's diamonds are processed from South Africa by a country called De Beers. Cecil Rhodes is a part of it. In fact, Southern Africa in general is a mineralogical storehouse of treasure. And so Rhodes is behind the discovery of diamonds, of gold, and of other precious metals throughout this region. Now, the Afrikaners are on top of a lot of it. The Afrikaners, the Boers, the Orange Free State, the Transvaal, and beyond them, the Matabele tribes. So Rhodes begins making deals with as many people as possible to secure the mineral rights, and he becomes super rich and politically powerful. He personally does a deal with the king of the Matabele, who thinks he's allowing the whites to come into his country and just, dig under the ground for a little bit and then leave. What he really is doing is signing away all the mineral rights to the land that his people occupy on the surface. Anything below the surface is going to belong to Rhodes and his company. And Rhodes sends a column of settlers in the early 1890s beyond the Afrikaner republics to establish what he calls Rhodesia, what is later divided into Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia. Rhodes ends up surrounding the Boer republics. You've got the Portuguese in Mozambique on the east. But with the exception of the Portuguese, you've got British-dominated Natal, British-dominated Cape Colony, British-dominated Bechuanaland, British-dominated Rhodesia, completely surrounding the Afrikaners. I think it's 1894 or 1895 or 1896. In the mid-1890s, Rhodes organizes what's called the Jameson Raid out of Rhodesia into Pretoria. The Jameson Raid is designed to overthrow the Afrikaner Republic, the Transvaal. It fails. The leader of the Transvaal, a farmer named Paul Kruger, who looks like an Amishman but is not a pacifist, sees the English as a clear and present danger. Now, the English and the Boer had fought one another before, but in 1899, the Second Anglo-Boer War breaks out. 1899 to 1902, the British try to conquer the Orange Free State and the Transvaal from the white Dutch Afrikaners. There are a few things that come out of this war, like concentration camps. The Boer operated in what are called commandos, where that word comes from. A commando is a group of Boer on horseback that travel across the veldt, that's the plains, living off the land and waging guerrilla war against the British. Now, at first, the Boer actually defeat the British in open battle, driving them out of the region. But when the British start moving in with massive forces, the British are now faced with an enemy that is practicing modern guerrilla war. The Boer have a better rifle than the British at long range, the 1895 Mauser. The Boer understand modern soldiers. They are not Zulus. They are modern people. And the British end up leading in this war like they haven't since the Crimean War. The British Army and the imperial forces out of Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere begin taking lots and lots of casualties in this war. So what the British do is they introduce concentration camps, not the Nazi death camps. What they do is they gather the Boer population within barbed wire, and they protect the Boer population so that the Boer population cannot serve as a basis for the commandos. The commandos can't get food from the Boers because the Boers are all behind barbed wire. The problem is these concentration camps become disease-ridden. They don't always get enough medical supplies. They certainly don't always get enough food. And so a lot of Boer women and children and old men die in these concentration camps. It is not something that the British should be proud of, but they invent them. They concentrate the population behind fencing so that the ranging guerrilla fighters, the commandos, can't benefit from being supported by farmers on their own farmsteads. In this war, a young Winston Churchill, having survived the last cavalry charge in the battles in the Sudan, has left the service and become a reporter. He's a war reporter. And so he goes to South Africa to report on the Boer War. And he's on a train that's captured by the Boer. And they bring him to a prison camp. And there's a famous photograph that I'd show you if it wasn't for YouTube, which I may show you at some point anyway. And it's a picture of Boer prisoners, prisoners of the Boers who are English. And it has Churchill in it. And there's a guy looking down and dejected. And that's what a lot of prisoners are. They're depressed. They don't know what they're going to do. There's another guy who looks kind of, "Oi! Come over here! I'll fight ya!" And he's stupid because he's going to challenge the guards and they're going to beat on him until he breaks. And you've got a few other personalities all dealing with defeat. And then off to the side, you've got Churchill looking into the far distance, looking triumphant. That indicates his indomitable personality. Within a week of that picture being taken, Churchill escapes. He escapes from Boer custody and fights his way back to British lines. And he becomes a hero for it. It's the beginning of his political career. In the end, the weight of numbers and forces that the British are able to bring to bear breaks the back of the Boer resistance. The Afrikaners are defeated, and the Transvaal and the Orange Free State are brought into British South Africa. However, the British practice here one of their wisest peace treaties. After the Anglo-Boer War, they set up a very generous peace that's going to allow, by 1910, self-government within the empire for the Transvaal and the Orange Free State and the rest of South Africa. The Union of South Africa is going to be formed based on this. And the Union of South Africa, their version of the USA, is a combination of English from Cape Colony and Natal and Boer from the Transvaal and the Orange Free State ruling together. There are three capitals. The executive capital is Pretoria, capital of the old Transvaal. The legislative capital is Cape Town. And the judicial capital is about halfway between the mining town called Bloemfontein, where actually J.R.R. Tolkien was born. His father was involved in South Africa before the Boer War. The Union of South Africa is ruled over by presidents who were leaders of commando units. Peter Botha, Jan Christian Smuts. And this is important because when World War I comes, a lot of the Boers want to side with Germany because Germany is the only country that sided with the Boers against the British. They didn't go to war, but they supplied the Boers with weapons and they gave support diplomatically, and they gave what support they could. However, in both the First and the Second World Wars, the Union of South Africa remains a staunch, loyal British ally. The Boers actually suppress their own nationalists within. In both wars, there are violent interchanges between pro-German Boers and the Boer-dominated South African government. The South Africans then conquer German Southwest Africa, what we now call Namibia, and German East Africa, what we now call Tanzania. And they contribute troops further afield. So in both world wars, the fact that Britain was generous enough with the peace to allow the Boers to rule South Africa, so long as they ruled it within the British Empire, makes for a very key ally when the chips are down for Britain when they were fighting Germany twice in the early 20th century. Jan Christian Smuts is an interesting fellow. Have you ever heard of holistic philosophy? Holistic philosophy is the belief that you shouldn't see something in isolation. Western science tends to see something in isolation. Here's a smidgen, and we want to understand the smidgen. So what we'll do is we'll X-ray the smidgen, and we'll take samples and learn about the molecular structure of the smidgen. If it's alive, we'll dissect a dead smidgen. And we'll learn all we can about the smidgen in isolation as a discrete, distinct thing. Very individualistic, very atomic, very Western. Holistic philosophy takes some notions from Confucianism. You can't, and from Aristotle, you can't understand a smidgen without understanding how it fits into its natural ecosystem. Where do smidgens come from? What do smidgens do? How do they interact with one another? Do they reproduce sexually or asexually? What, in the end, is the smidgen's contribution to their ecosystem? What do they take? What do they give? Holistic philosophy is something that Jan Christian Smuts, a South African Boer politician, helps develop. He's one of the founding holistic philosophers of modern times. He wants to see things in their context. He wants to see things not as you take them apart and you study them dissecting. You see them in their environment. You see them as a whole. I just think is interesting. Okay. Now we shift to the emergence of the new great power of the late 19th and early 20th century, the United States of America. The United States of America starts out as a republic along the Atlantic seaboard that beats the British and achieves independence. Immediately, they get the Great Lakes region as well as part of the settlement, which we call at first the Northwest Territories, which ultimately become the Midwestern states, Illinois, Michigan, that sort of thing. In the about 15 years after the American Republic is formed, we do a deal under Thomas Jefferson with Napoleon for the Louisiana Purchase. And suddenly the territory of the United States doubles as we get the drainage basin of the Mississippi River south of a certain point. Lewis and Clark are sent west to explore this great new purchase, which goes as far as the Montana-Idaho border. In fact, Lewis and Clark passed down the Columbia River, and there's a reason why Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkstone, Washington are called what they are, because Lewis and Clark passed through there. There's a Lewis and Clark trail around here. You may know more about this stuff than I do. And eventually, the notion is that the republic shouldn't just stretch to the Rockies, that it should be a republic from sea to shining sea. And during the period from the early to late 1800s, we moved beyond the Louisiana Purchase into the Oregon territories. We split the Oregon territories with the British so that the northern border of the United States is the northern border of Idaho, that latitude, that line of latitude. And we absorbed both Texas and California, which are independent republics, although California was really not that long an independent republic. It was intended from the beginning to become part of the United States. Texas, on the other hand, might have made it go as an independent country, but in the end didn't. And with the Gadsden Purchase, allowing a railroad to be built in the Southwest between Texas and California, the contiguous 48 United States territory is established. However, it's not like the land is empty. The land is occupied by Paleolithic and Neolithic peoples. You don't have Indian civilizations, except for the Anasazi, the Pueblo, the Hopi, Indians of the Southwest that grow corn and live in settlements. The vast majority of the Indian tribes of North America that are brought into the United States are nomadic hunter-gatherers of the Great Plains. There are also forest Indians that are like the Cherokees on the verge of Neolithic societies, and that they are farming-oriented and peaceful. The Cherokees have an interesting history. If you want to learn about any particular tribe, I strongly recommend that you think about studying the Cherokee, just because there is so much there. They tried to meet us on our terms. A Cherokee develops a written language for the Cherokee that is based on English but is not English. The Cherokee become one of what are called the civilized tribes. They try to meet Europeans on equal ground. Unfortunately, the American government and its record towards the Indians is not a good record. And we ultimately moved the Cherokee off their lands out to Oklahoma, what was then called the Indian Territories, in a movement that was called the Trail of Tears, for a good reason. It was a death march. The very worst thing ever done by the American government was done to the Indians. Under the Jackson administration, a plan was hatched to depopulate the tribes that stood in the way from sea to shining sea. And so blankets ridden with cholera and other diseases were taken without being washed from East Coast hospital wards. And they were shipped to Indian trading posts and practically given away for a song to the Indians. Indians who had no natural immunities to this type of virulent disease. It's sometimes called the Indian blanket trick. And what it did was it spread cholera and other diseases throughout the population within the Indian Territory, what we now call Oklahoma, and westward. It is not fair, reasonable, or logical to blame Columbus or any of the early explorers for the fact that at least half of the population of two continents died of disease. At no time did the Europeans understand disease well enough to practice biological warfare. That was an accident. If at some point we ever encounter aliens from off the Earth, or if we establish colonies off the Earth, we're going to have to be very careful about any viruses that spring up in alien soil coming here when we have no immunity. That could wipe out most of the human race. But the innocence of the early explorers is not shared by the Jackson administration. It is willful and intentional biological warfare that was waged for a time against the Indians. Also, again and again, in good faith, tribes make treaties with the government of the United States. And they expect that these treaties will be honored. But again and again, something happens, and they're not. The classic example is a peace treaty that ends an ongoing war with the Sioux Nation. They call themselves Lakota. The other enemies call them Sioux because the word Sioux means enemy. Please make sure your noses are covered. And the peace treaty promised that the Sioux lands of the Black Hills of South Dakota, that also border in Montana and Wyoming and North Dakota, but primarily they're in South Dakota, are going to be left as Indian tribal lands forevermore, because those lands, those hills, are considered sacred. They're places where the dead are buried, and different Indian beliefs about their dead. You look at any culture, and the way the dead are treated is a serious matter, because we know all our loved ones at some point are going to be dead. At some point we're going to be dead. We want the dead to be honored. But then gold is discovered in the South, in the Black Hills. And an American government that cannot control its own people is left to go, what can I do to the Sioux as thousands and thousands of white prospectors, and black, few, show up and start panhandling for gold in the Black Hills? The Sioux go to war because the treaty has been violated. And it's in that war that the greatest disaster to American arms in the Indian Wars occurs. A Civil War hero, Cavalry General George Armstrong Custer, a man with long glowing hair and big golden mustaches, a man who successfully outfought Jeb Stuart, who was the greatest cavalry general of the Confederacy, and who is thinking of running in the 1876 presidential election on the Democrat ticket. This is a general who is very political and who's preparing to run for office, decides that he's going to get some glory. In fact, there are rumors that Custer himself orchestrated the gold strike and intentionally set things up so that the Sioux would have no choice but to go to war so that he could suppress them. This is actually a plausible theory. So, the Sioux go to war, and Custer brings his 7th Cavalry into the Black Hills region and starts pursuing Sitting Bull, the war chief of the Sioux. At a place called the Little Bighorn in southeastern Montana, the two armies meet. For reasons that I can't fathom, Custer establishes his base of operations at the bottom of a valley, and he has his cavalry dismount. The Sioux come riding down on him from all directions. There's an old routine about this. If you could do a coin toss at the beginning of a war, Custer must have lost the coin toss, because he had to sit there on his feet at the bottom of a valley while all the Indians in the west rode down on him. The 7th Cavalry under Custer was completely wiped out, to the last man. However, for the last 50 years, men won drinks at bars by claiming to be the sole survivor of Little Bighorn. The truth is, there were more sole survivors of Little Bighorn than there were men in the 7th Cavalry by the end. However, it, in the long run, was futile. The Nez Perce tried to flee to Canada in the early 1890s. and they were pursued by an overly ambitious cavalry that wanted to keep them on the reservation. And at Wounded Knee, the Nez Perce camp was shelled by artillery. And not wiped out, but certainly massacred. And the survivors were returned to reservation. So, if the United States has sins, and it does, those sins were perpetrated by slave owners upon the slaves, and by the United States government upon the natives. It was not a clean conquest. It was a series of treaties that were broken at will by one side again and again and again. This isn't to say the Indians were Simon Pure. If you want to learn about how fierce the Indians can be, how dangerous and how atrocity prone they can be, study the Apaches. The Apaches were not nice people to their enemies, not nice at all. But the Republic is brought to the Pacific in this fashion. Next time, we'll study the rise of the U.S. as a world power and the Belle Epoque. I will predict to you that either at the end of this week or at the beginning of next week, there will be a unit survey, or should I say a unit exam, because Unit 3 will end either this week or very early next week. So you may want to start studying for that. I see no questions. Are there?
I'm doing a war dance.
A war dance, yes. Well, just understand, you didn't do it to them, and you shouldn't feel guilty about it. Have a good day.